The crisp April air carried a hint of warmth, signaling the arrival of spring, as sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Mark's Church in the quiet seaside town of Devonshire. The vibrant hues of crimson, emerald, and gold danced across the bridal suite, painting the soft ivory of Sophia Caldwell's wedding gown in an otherworldly glow. Sophia stood before an ornate mirror, her hands trembling as she adjusted the lace-trimmed veil. The image reflected was one of poised perfection, an elegant woman ready to step into a life she had spent years imagining. With its intricate beadwork and flowing train, the gown cost more than Sophia had ever envisioned spending, yet today, it felt symbolic, almost necessary. After all, this wasn't just any wedding. It was a union with Nathaniel Blackwell, the heir to one of the largest shipping empires in Britain. A man of power, poise, and charm, Nathaniel had swept Sophia off her feet from the moment they met at a gala 2 years prior. For the first time in years, Sophia had allowed herself to dream of a future that was stable, beautiful, and full of possibility. "You look radiant, my dear," her mother, Eleanor, whispered, stepping forward to adjust a few loose strands of her daughter's curled hair. There was an emotion in her voice, pride, yes, but also something softer, almost wistful, as if Eleanor understood the weight of the moment better than anyone. The antique grandfather clock in the corner chimed 10. Sophia glanced nervously at the hour hand. The ceremony was set to begin in just an hour, and every detail of the day had been carefully planned. The guest list boasted an array of prominent figures, celebrities, politicians, and business moguls. This wasn't just a wedding. It was an event. "Everything will be perfect," Eleanor assured her, though her tone had an undercurrent of worry. Sophia nodded, taking a deep breath. "He'll be here soon. He promised me he'd never let me down." The hum of conversation grew downstairs as the arriving guests filled the chapel. Sophia's maid of honor, Olivia, entered the room, phone in hand. "I just heard from Nathaniel's assistant," she said, her voice tinged with amusement. "He's stopping by the market. Something about getting his grandmother her favorite tea for after the ceremony. Typical Nathaniel, isn't it?" The comment brought a soft laugh from Sophia, who shook her head affectionately. Nathaniel's thoughtfulness was one of the many reasons she loved him. He had always put family above all else, and his bond with his aging grandmother, who had raised him after his parents' untimely passing, was something Sophia deeply admired. But as the minutes ticked by, the lightness in the room began to dim. The clock struck 10:30, then 11. Olivia tried to mask her concern, but the glances she exchanged with Eleanor spoke volumes. Sophia began checking her phone obsessively, scrolling through unread messages for reassurance. "It's just traffic," Eleanor suggested, though the hesitation in her voice betrayed her words. By noon, when the first strains of the wedding march should have echoed through the chapel, Sophia was still in the bridal suite. The once bustling church grew silent as guests exchanged worried whispers, their unease palpable. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Sophia's father, Henry Caldwell, stepped in, his face grave. His presence alone was enough to make Sophia's heart drop. "Dad," she whispered, clutching the back of a nearby chair for support. "What is it?" Henry hesitated, his hands clenching and unclenching. "Sophia, Nathaniel, he isn't here. His car is still at the house, but no one knows where he's gone. His grandmother hasn't heard from him either." The room spun. Sophia's vision blurred as her mind raced to make sense of the words. He wouldn't leave. Not Nathaniel. He loved her. He had planned every detail of their honeymoon himself, going as far as sending her daily reminders of how much he looked forward to their future. "He'll come back," Sophia muttered, her voice barely audible, more to herself than anyone else. "He'll come back. He has to." But as the hours passed, and the guests slowly filtered out of the church, offering their pitying glances and awkward condolences, the truth became undeniable. Nathaniel Blackwell, the man who had promised her forever, had disappeared without a trace on their wedding day. Later that evening, long after the untouched feast had been cleared and the ornate floral arrangements taken down, Sophia found herself alone in the empty garden behind the chapel. Her gown was still pristine, though her carefully styled hair had begun to unravel, and dark mascara streaked her cheeks. She clutched her phone tightly, her hands trembling as she reread his last message over and over again. Popping out for tea. Back in a few minutes, my love. The setting sun cast long, golden shadows across the garden. The once vivid flowers blurred Sophia's vision, reducing their vibrant petals to muted outlines. For a long moment, she sat there, letting the silence envelop her. Finally, she stood, legs unsteady but growing stronger with each breath. I can't stay here, she whispered to herself. Not in this town. Not in this life. Sophia knew she couldn't face the whispers, the pitying smiles, or the inevitable reminders of what could have been. Tomorrow, she would pack her things and leave Devonshire behind. London, a city of anonymity and new beginnings, called to her like a lifeline. What Sophia didn't yet realize, as she left the garden with her shattered dreams, was that sometimes the most beautiful journeys begin with heartbreak. The early morning air was damp and heavy as Sophia Caldwell stepped off the train at Paddington Station. The towering buildings of London loomed ahead, gray and indifferent, a stark contrast to Devonshire's soft, quaint charm. She gripped the handle of her single suitcase, a small, worn piece of luggage holding all that remained of her old life. With her, she carried a quiet resolve that comes not from strength but necessity. Her destination was a small third-floor walk-up flat in Notting Hill, rented sight unseen through a recommendation from her father's old friend. It wasn't much. A creaky floorboard greeted her at the doorway, and the single window overlooked a dull brick wall, but it was hers. Here, no one would know her as the abandoned bride. Here, she could begin again. The first few weeks were a blur of adjustment. Sophia had secured a position as an editorial assistant at a boutique publishing house, a modest job with long hours and little pay, but it offered her purpose. In those quiet moments surrounded by towering shelves of books, she found solace, an escape from the questions that haunted her at night. Still, London's vastness could be unkind. On days when the rain wouldn't let up, and the city's constant noise seemed to press against her skin, loneliness took root. Sophia's days were filled with work, her evenings with silence. A worn copy of Pride and Prejudice sat on her bedside table, a gift from Nathaniel on their first anniversary. She'd meant to leave it behind, but it had slipped into her suitcase like a ghost of what once was. The first sign that something was different came one morning when nausea overtook her in the middle of preparing tea. At first, she dismissed it as stress or exhaustion, but when the waves returned, more substantial and more persistent, a sinking suspicion began to form. 3 pregnancy tests lay on the bathroom counter. Positive. All 3 of them. Sophia sat on the bathtub's edge, her hands trembling as the truth settled in. The ache of betrayal from Nathaniel's disappearance paled compared to this new, terrifying reality. She wasn't just starting over. She was starting over with a child. His child. But fate had an even more remarkable twist in store. You're not just expecting a baby, Dr. Chen, the kindly obstetrician, explained the next afternoon, her voice gentle but firm. You're expecting 3 triplets, Sophia whispered, her voice hoarse. Dr. Chen nodded, pointing to the ultrasound screen where 3 distinct heartbeats pulsed in perfect rhythm. All perfectly healthy. Sophia's laugh came out choked, a blend of disbelief, fear, and something softer she couldn't name. 3 lives. 3 pieces of Nathaniel. Her hand instinctively moved to her still flat stomach as tears welled in her eyes. She had no choice now but to survive, not just for herself but for them. The golden sun bathed Holland Park in soft light as the morning mist burned away. Children's laughter echoed through the air, blending with the chirping of birds. Sophia Caldwell sat on a wooden bench, her eyes following her 3 children as they played beneath the climbing frame. Herferless leader Charlotte had taken charge, as usual, her copper curls bouncing with every daring jump she made. With his father's sharp green eyes and a more contemplative nature, Thomas observed from the top of the slide, calculating every move before taking it. Little Sophie, the youngest by mere minutes, sat cross-legged in the sandpit, carefully building an intricate castle with the precision of an artist. "Mommy, watch this," Charlotte called, performing a wobbly cartwheel on the grass. Sophia smiled warmly and clapped. Be careful, love. 5 years had passed since that fateful day at St. Mark's Church, and while the wounds had never fully healed, life had found a way to bloom again. Those first few years were the hardest. Midnight feedings, endless diaper changes, and moments of overwhelming exhaustion nearly broke her, but each time, she pressed on. Her children were her anchor, her reason to keep going. Working at the publishing house offered her flexibility, allowing her to juggle motherhood and a career. It was no mansion in Devonshire, but their small, cozy flat in Notting Hill was a home built on love and laughter. The sound of tiny feet running toward her pulled Sophia back to the present. Charlotte reached her first, breathless and beaming. "Mommy, Thomas said there's no way I can climb to the top of the jungle gym, but I'm going to prove him wrong." "Charlotte," Thomas protested as he arrived a moment later, "I only said it's unsafe, not impossible." "And I think it's magic," Sophie chimed in, having appeared at her mother's side with sand still on her hands. "The jungle gym might be enchanted." Sophia laughed softly. "Why don't you three stick to something less dangerous for now? Grandma and Grandpa are waiting at the cafe, and we don't want to be late." The cafe had become their family tradition every Sunday, a simple routine that connected their lives amidst the chaos. Margaret and Henry Caldwell had moved to London shortly after the triplets were born, their unwavering support turning what could have been an impossible journey into something beautiful. As Sophia gathered their things, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window of a nearby shop. Her hair, now cropped into a practical bob, framed her face, which bore faint laugh lines earned from years of joy and worry. She was no longer the woman who had stood at the altar in Devonshire, waiting for a promise that would never be fulfilled. That woman had been fragile, uncertain. This version of herself was different, more substantial, steadier, forged through hardship and love. "Mommy, can we get ice cream after lunch?" Sophie tugged at her sleeve. "We'll see, sweetheart," Sophia replied, offering her a playful wink. As they walked toward the cafe, Charlotte skipped ahead, leading the way, while Thomas and Sophie fell into step beside their mother. Sophia listened to their chatter. The stories about playground victories, imaginary dragons, and magic spells, and felt gratitude. Life hadn't turned out the way she had once envisioned. There was no grand estate, no moonlit dinners or champagne toasts. But here, in the steady rhythm of their small, precious routines, she had built something real. It was enough. Or so she thought. From across the street, behind the tinted windows of a sleek black car, a man watched them with a face frozen in disbelief. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to anchor himself to the moment. Nathaniel Blackwell hadn't expected this. 5 years ago, he'd disappeared, convinced he was doing the right thing. He had run from his fears, from a future he hadn't felt ready for. But now, watching Sophia with 3 children who carried pieces of him in their faces, the copper curls, the green eyes, the dimpled smiles, he felt the full weight of his cowardice. The driver turned back. "Sir, would you like me to proceed?" No, Nathaniel's voice was hoarse. "Wait." His gaze lingered on Sophia as she disappeared into the cafe, her laughter carried on the wind. It was the same, yet different, softer, fuller, touched by years he hadn't been a part of. Nathaniel took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He had run away to avoid his responsibilities, but now they stood before him, undeniable. 3 children, a woman he had once loved beyond measure. His voice broke the silence. "Find out everything you can about them. Their routines, where they live, everything." "Yes, Mr. Blackwell," his assistant replied, but Nathaniel barely heard him. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar, determination. Nathaniel Blackwell had returned to London, and this time, he wouldn't run. It was a gray Wednesday afternoon when the bell above the door of Bramble's bookshop chimed. The shop, a charming nook tucked into a quiet corner of Notting Hill, smelled of old paper, leather bindings, and freshly brewed coffee from the little counter in the back. It was one of Sophia's favorite places, an after-school stop where her children could explore the shelves of stories and lose themselves in a world of imagination. 10 minutes, Sophia called gently as Charlotte dashed for the adventure section. Thomas wandered toward the nonfiction aisle, and Sophie meandered to the corner with a display of illustrated dragon books. Then it's straight home for dinner. She allowed herself a small smile. This little routine, this life she had carefully built, felt perfect in its simplicity. But perfection, as she would soon learn, is often fleeting. From behind the poetry section, Nathaniel Blackwell emerged. He wasn't the man Sophia remembered. Gone was the polished arrogance of a young heir accustomed to getting his way. In its place stood someone more subdued, his sharp green eyes softer, lined with fatigue, and something that looked like regret. He wore a simple blue sweater and trousers, clothes meant to blend in, though they did nothing to disguise the unmistakable aura of wealth and presence. Their eyes met across the room. For Sophia, time froze. The breath she had drawn caught painfully in her chest as recognition slammed into her. Her fingers gripped the edge of the shelf to steady herself. No, this isn't happening. Nathaniel's gaze locked onto hers, a storm of emotions flickering across his face. Shock, guilt, and something deeper she couldn't quite name. "Hello, Sophia," he said softly, his voice a low rumble. She flinched as though struck. No, it was all she could manage. A trembling word filled with disbelief and fury. "Mommy, look at this dragon book." Sophie's voice piped up from behind her, oblivious to the air's tension. She appeared at her mother's side, clutching a bright green book with gold embossing. "It's about a dragon that sings." Sophia quickly knelt to her daughter's level, her voice steadying as she kissed Sophie's temple. "Go find your brother and sister, sweetheart. We're leaving." "But now, Sophie." Sophia's sharp tone startled her, and Sophie, wide-eyed, hurried toward the others. Sophia straightened, anger bubbling to the surface as she glared at Nathaniel. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice low enough not to carry to the children. "I saw you," Nathaniel admitted, his hands trembling slightly, "at the cafe a few weeks ago. I didn't know. I didn't expect." "That's obvious." Her voice dripped with venom. "You disappeared, Nathaniel. Vanished like a coward when I needed you most. Now you're standing here, invading my life like you have any right." "I know I don't," he cut in, his voice raw. "I don't have the right to be here. I don't have the right to ask for anything. But Sophia, please." "To what?" Her eyes narrowed. "Explain? To say you're sorry? That you regret abandoning me, abandoning them?" She crossed her arms, guarding herself against the onslaught of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Nathaniel swallowed hard, his gaze flicking toward the children. Charlotte, bouncing on her toes as she debated books with Thomas and Sophie, humming to herself in the corner. His chest ached at the sight of them, his children, unmistakably his, though strangers to him now. "They're mine, aren't they?" His voice was a hoarse whisper, barely audible. Sophia's face paled, but her eyes burned with fire. "They are mine," she shot back, her voice trembling. "You lost the right to call them yours when you walked out that day. Don't you dare claim them now?" "I want to make this right," Nathaniel pleaded. "I know I can't undo what I did, but I must try. They're my children, Sophia. I deserve a chance." "You deserve nothing." Sophia's voice rose sharply, causing the children to glance curiously in their direction. She lowered it again, barely controlling her fury. "You deserve nothing, Nathaniel Blackwell. Nothing from me and nothing from them." He stepped closer, his hands open in a gesture of surrender. "I just need to talk to you." "Don't." Sophia's voice was icy, her body trembling. She turned away, calling to the children. "Come on, loves. We're leaving." Nathaniel took a step after them, his voice desperate. "Sophia, wait. Please, meet me tomorrow at the cafe where I saw you. No lawyers. No demands. Just you and me." Sophia didn't turn back. She ushered her children out the door, leaving Nathaniel standing there, his words echoing in the quiet shop. The next day, Sophia sat at their usual cafe table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. She wasn't sure why she'd come. Perhaps it was the part of her that needed closure and to understand what had made the man she once loved run. The door swung open at precisely 4 p.m. Nathaniel entered, dressed simply in dark jeans and a gray sweater, his presence almost awkward in its humility. Sophia noted the tension in his shoulders and the slight tremor in his hands as he approached the table. "You're punctual," she said flatly as he sat across from her. "At least for some appointments." Nathaniel flinched but didn't argue. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. "Let's be clear about something," she replied, her voice cold. "This conversation isn't about us. It's about my children." He looked at her sharply. "Our children." Sophia's hands tightened around her mug. "Don't push me, Nathaniel." "I'm not here to push you," he said quickly. "I'm here because I need you to understand. That day, our wedding day, I was terrified. I looked at my reflection and saw my father staring back at me." Sophia frowned, surprised. "Your father?" Nathaniel's voice was low and rough. "He wasn't a good man, Sophia. He was cruel. Emotionally, mentally. Nothing I did was ever good enough for him. No achievement ever worthy of praise. When he died, I felt relief. What kind of son feels relief when his parents are gone?" He looked down, his jaw tight. "The day we were supposed to get married, I realized I was about to become him. I thought I would fail you. Fail our children." "So you ran?" she asked bitterly. "Yes," Nathaniel admitted. "I ran. I thought I was sparing you. I thought you'd be better off without me." He looked up at her, his expression haunted. "I was wrong." Sophia stared at him, her anger warring with something else. Grief, maybe, or disappointment. "You didn't just run from me, Nathaniel. You ran from them. You left me to raise 3 children alone. Do you have any idea what that was like?" He winced. "No, I don't. But I want to. I want to know them, Sophia. Not as a stranger, but as their father. I don't deserve a second chance, but I'm asking for one anyway." Sophia shook her head, overwhelmed. "It's not that simple. I know." His voice softened. "But let me try. Let me earn their trust and yours. One day at a time." Sophia closed her eyes, his words pressing heavily on her heart. She thought of her children, Thomas's sharp observations, Charlotte's fiery independence, Sophie's gentle dreams, and how much of Nathaniel lived in each of them. "They're happy," she said firmly. "They're loved. I won't let you hurt them." "I don't want to hurt them," he replied. "I want to be better, for them and foe." For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Sophia sighed, the weight of the past pressing down on her shoulders. If I let you meet them, it will be on my terms. No big gestures. No promises you can't keep. And if you ever hurt them, Nathaniel, I swear you'll never see them again." "I won't," Nathaniel vowed, his voice breaking. "I promise." Sophia stood, grabbing her coat. "I'll think about it. You'll hear from me." As she left the cafe, her heart thundered in her chest. For the first time in 5 years, the wall she had built around her children's lives had cracked, and whether it would break wholly remained to be seen. Nathaniel sat alone at the table, hope flickering in his chest. He had been given a slight chance, fragile as glass, but he would cling to it with everything he had. This time, he wouldn't run. It was a crisp Saturday morning when Nathaniel Blackwell stood at the edge of Holland Park, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. His usual confidence had abandoned him, leaving behind only the nervous energy of a man about to face a reckoning. He scanned the playground, searching for familiar faces, until he spotted them. Sophia sat on a bench, her figure poised but tense, her eyes watching the children with the vigilance of a protective mother. Nearby, Charlotte, Thomas, and Sophie played on the climbing frame, their laughter ringing like music. For a moment, Nathaniel froze. These were his children, his flesh and blood, yet they felt like strangers. He took a steadying breath and approached. Sophia saw him before the children did. Her gaze met his, guarded but calm, as if warning him to tread carefully. As he drew closer, the children noticed. Charlotte, always the boldest, was the first to approach, her copper curls bouncing as she marched over to him. "Are you the man from the bookstore?" she asked, her hands on her hips. "Yes," Nathaniel said, crouching slightly to meet her gaze. "My name is Nathaniel. He glanced at Sophia, who gave him a subtle nod. "I'm your father." Charlotte's eyes narrowed, her expression suspicious. "Why didn't you come before?" It was Thomas who spoke next, his voice soft but sharp. "Mommy said you were scared. Is that true?" Nathaniel nodded slowly, his throat tight. "Yes, I was scared. I thought I wasn't good enough to be your father. But I was wrong, and I'm so sorry I wasn't here." Sophie, the quiet dreamer, stepped closer, clutching her favorite dragon book. "Are you scared now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel's heart ached. "I'm not scared anymore," he said honestly, "because I want to be here for you if you'll let me." The children exchanged glances, their youthful intuition catching things words couldn't convey. Finally, Charlotte stepped forward and extended her hand. "Okay," she said simply, "but you have to earn it." Nathaniel took her hand, his eyes misting. "I will." The first meeting was tentative, filled with careful conversations and curious stares. Nathaniel had brought small, thoughtful gifts, books for each child, chosen based on Sophia's descriptions of their personalities. Charlotte received a book of world mythology, Thomas a detailed guide to space exploration, and Sophie an illustrated collection of dragon tales. Sophie's eyes lit up as she hugged her book tightly. "Did you like dragons when you were little, too?" "I did," Nathaniel replied. "Welsh green dragons were my favorite. They're supposed to be musical, you know." "I like Chinese dragons better," Sophie declared, her voice gaining confidence. "They're wise and lucky," Charlotte chimed in, flipping through her mythology book. "And they can fly. Can we get a dragon someday?" Nathaniel laughed softly, his shoulders relaxing for the first time. "We'll see about that." For the next hour, they talked about dragons, space, and myths, the children gradually warming to his presence. Sophia watched from the bench, her emotions tangled with hope, fear, and cautious optimism. When it was time to leave, Sophie approached Nathaniel, holding out her dragon book. "You can borrow it," she said solemnly, "but you have to give it back next time." "I promise," Nathaniel said, his voice thick. As they walked away, hand in hand with Sophia, the children chattered about their new books, their laughter ringing out in the crisp air. Nathaniel stayed behind, his heart full but heavy. It was a start, a fragile, tentative start, but it was more than he deserved. Over the next several weeks, Saturday mornings became sacred. Nathaniel arrived promptly at 10 a.m., always bearing thoughtful gifts, not lavish toys, but small items that showed he was paying attention. A magnifying glass for Thomas after he mentioned wanting to examine leaves. A sketchpad and colored pencils for Sophie to encourage her artistic streak. A jump rope for Charlotte, who had recently expressed an interest in learning new tricks. Their meetings evolved from brief encounters in the park to carefully planned activities. There was a visit to the Natural History Museum, where Thomas spent hours peppering Nathaniel with questions about dinosaurs and planets. The following week, they attended Sophie's art class at the community center, where she proudly showed him her watercolors. Another Saturday was spent at the Children's Theater, where Charlotte performed an impromptu monologue as a Queen of the Dragons. To Sophia's surprise, Nathaniel was patient and engaged, never pushing too hard but letting the children approach him in their own time. His presence wasn't grandiose but steady and reliable. One evening, as Sophia tucked Thomas into bed, he asked a question that caught her off guard. "Why doesn't Nathaniel come to our house?" he asked, his green eyes serious. Sophia hesitated, her heart pounding. "Would you like him to?" Thomas nodded. "He promised to help me build my new space station model. And Sophie wants to show him her dragon drawings." Sophia smiled softly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I'll think about it." The following Sunday, Nathaniel stood at the door of their modest flat, holding a bag of groceries. "I thought we could cook together," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice. The children swarmed around him, eager to show him their rooms, toys, and little world. Nathaniel followed them, taking in every detail, the crayon drawings on the walls, the mismatched furniture, the sense of warmth and love that filled the space. "This is where we have breakfast," Charlotte announced, leading him to the small kitchen. "Mommy makes heart-shaped pancakes on our birthdays." "Well," Nathaniel said, rolling up his sleeves, "how about today we make something new?" The kitchen was soon filled with laughter and chaos as they made homemade pasta. Flour dusted every surface, including their faces, and Nathaniel found himself kneeling on the floor to help Sophie pick up a spilled bag of dough. "You're different here," Sophia observed quietly as she wiped the counter. Nathaniel looked up, surprised. "Different? How?" "More real," she said simply. "Less rehearsed." He paused, considering her words. "In the park or at the museum, I always felt like I was auditioning for the role of father. But here, in your space, it feels natural. Like I'm part of the picture instead of just observing it." That afternoon, as they sat around the table eating their messy, imperfect meal, Sophie looked up at Nathaniel and asked, "Will you come for Sunday lunch again?" Nathaniel glanced at Sophia, who hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Maybe next Sunday, you can help us paint the bedrooms," she suggested, surprising herself. The children cheered, their excitement filling the small flat. Nathaniel's grateful smile said more than words ever could. Nathaniel lingered in the hallway as he prepared to leave, his eyes falling on the height marks penciled onto the wall. 5 years of growth he had missed. "I missed so much," he said softly. "You're here now," Sophia replied, her voice free of bitterness for the first time. Nathaniel turned to her, his expression serious. "I want to make this official. Child support, visitation, everything. Not to take anything away from you, but to show them I'm committed. That I'm not going anywhere." Sophia studied his face, the sincerity etched into every line. "Let me think about it," she said finally. "This isn't just about legal documents. It's about trust." He nodded. "I'll wait as long as it takes." As he stepped out into the crisp evening air, Nathaniel felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he wasn't running. The Blackwell estate was a sprawling Georgian mansion perched on the edge of the English countryside, surrounded by lush gardens and towering oaks. Its grandeur was intimidating, but for Sophia, it was a house filled with memories, some beautiful, others haunting. Today, however, it wasn't about the past. It was about the children meeting their great-grandmother, Victoria Blackwell, a woman who had been a silent thread in their lives without their knowing. Nathaniel stood by the car, helping Charlotte, Thomas, and Sophie climb. Each child stared at the house wide-eyed, taking in its sheer size. "It's like a castle," Sophie whispered, clutching her favorite dragon toy to her chest. "It's where I grew up," Nathaniel explained gently, his voice tinged with emotion. "And where your great-grandmother has lived her entire life." Sophia watched as Nathaniel knelt to the children's level, his expression soft but serious. "Remember what we talked about? Great-grandma Victoria isn't feeling well, so we need to be calm and quiet when we visit her. She's been looking forward to meeting you for a long time." The children nodded solemnly, sensing the gravity of the moment. As they approached the front entrance, the housekeeper, Mrs. Harrison, greeted them with a warm but tearful smile. "It's wonderful to meet you finally," she said, kneeling to the children's level. "You're all exactly as your great-grandmother described you in her letters." Sophia felt a pang in her chest, remembering the unopened letters Victoria had written over the years. She had kept them all, unable to throw them away, yet too afraid to read them. Victoria Blackwell's room was lit, the morning sun streaming through the tall windows. Fresh flowers adorned every surface, their delicate fragrance softening the room's somber undertones. Reclining against a stack of silk pillows, Victoria looked frail but regal, her silver hair neatly pinned and her piercing green eyes as sharp as ever. "So," she said softly as the children entered, "you've finally come to meet your old great-grandmother." The children hesitated at first, unsure of how to approach. But Victoria, ever perceptive, had prepared for this moment. Beside her bed sat 3 beautifully crafted music boxes, each unique. "Charlotte," Victoria began, her voice warm. "This one belonged to my grandmother. It plays a warrior's march, perfect for someone as fearless as you." Charlotte stepped forward, drawn to the ornate silver box. As the stirring melody filled the room, her eyes lit up. "It's amazing," she exclaimed, her earlier nervousness forgotten. "Thomas," Victoria continued, turning to the boy with curious eyes, "this is a puzzle box. You'll need to figure out how to open it before you can hear the music inside." Thomas accepted the wooden box reverently, his fingers already exploring its intricate carvings. And Sophie, Victoria said, her voice softening even more. This one tells a story. See the dragons carved on the sides? When you open it, they seem to dance to the music. Sophie's eyes widened as she took the delicate box, her tiny fingers tracing the intricate dragon motifs. Soon, the children were gathered around Victoria's bed, engrossed in their gifts. She shared stories with them, weaving tales of family history, her childhood, and Nathaniel's mischievous antics as a boy. He turned my fountain into a swimming pool for his pet ducks once, Victoria said, chuckling softly. You had ducks? Charlotte asked, her eyes wide. 3 of them, Nathaniel admitted, smiling sheepishly. They weren't supposed to live in the fountain, though. Sophia stood quietly in the corner, watching her children connect with a part of their heritage she had kept hidden for so long. She hadn't expected this warmth, this sense of belonging. You've done a wonderful job with them, Victoria said quietly when the children were momentarily distracted. Her voice carried a note of awe as she looked at Sophia. They're bright, strong, and full of life. I see so much Nathaniel in them, but their strength comes from you. Sophia felt a lump rise in her throat. I just did what I had to. Victoria reached for her hand, her grip surprisingly firm. You kept all my letters, she said knowingly, even if you never opened them. That tells me you never gave up on the idea of family. Sophia nodded, unable to speak, her emotions too raw. Before they left, Victoria asked for a private moment with the children. Sophia and Nathaniel waited in the hallway, the silence between them heavy but not uncomfortable. When the children emerged, each carried a small velvet pouch and their music boxes. Great-Grandma Victoria says these are our special secrets, Charlotte announced. We're not supposed to open them until Christmas. As they drove home, the children chattered excitedly about the visit, their music boxes, and the mysterious gifts. Sophie, however, was quieter than usual, her little hand resting over the pouch as though protecting it. She's sick, isn't she? Thomas asked suddenly, breaking the momentary silence. Nathaniel hesitated, then nodded. Yes, she is. But meeting you all made her very happy. Can we see her again? Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. Sophia glanced at Nathaniel in the rearview mirror and nodded. As often as she feels up to it. That evening, long after the children had gone to bed, Sophia finally opened the carved wooden box hidden beneath her bed. Inside were years of letters, each filled with Victoria's thoughts, hopes, and love for 3 children she had never met. As she read, tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in years, they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of healing. Sophia was in her tiny kitchen a week later, staring at her phone. She hesitated before typing out a message. Thank you for the visit. It meant everything to her. And them. Nathaniel's response came almost immediately. It meant everything to me, too. Thank you for letting it happen. Victoria became a central figure in their lives for the next several weeks. The children's visits brought her joy, and her presence gave them a sense of connection to their roots. Slowly, the distance between Nathaniel and Sophia began to close, not in the way of rekindled romance, but in the way of 2 people working together for the good of their children. On one of their visits, as Nathaniel played chess with Thomas in the garden, Sophia sat beside Victoria, sipping tea. He's changed, Victoria said suddenly, her gaze fixed on Nathaniel. Sophia nodded slowly. He's trying. For the first time, it feels real. Victoria's hand rested on Sophia's. Forgiveness isn't for him, my dear. It's for you. Carrying anger takes its toll, and you've carried enough already. Sophia didn't respond, but her heart absorbed the words. The turning point came during a quiet Sunday afternoon at Sophia's flat. Nathaniel had joined them for lunch, and as the children played in their room, he lingered at the kitchen table. I want to make things official, he said, his tone steady but gentle. Child support, visitation, everything. Not because I think I deserve it, but because I want the children to know I'm here to stay. Sophia studied him carefully, searching his face for any hint of insincerity. She found none. This isn't just about legal documents, Nathaniel, she said. This is about trust. You've come a long way, but trust takes time. I know, he replied. I'll wait as long as it takes. As he prepared to leave, Sophie tugged at his sleeve, handing him her dragon book. "You forgot to bring it back," she said shyly. Nathaniel knelt, his eyes misting. "I didn't forget, sweetheart. I just wanted to keep it safe for you." The warmth in Sophie's smile as she hugged her book to her chest was all the encouragement Sophia needed. That night, as she tucked the children into bed, Charlotte asked, "Do you think he'll stay this time?" Sophia kissed her forehead, her voice steady. "I think he's trying very hard to." And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe it. The air was buzzing with excitement in St. Margaret's Primary School Assembly Hall. Small plastic chairs had been neatly arranged for the parents and families of students performing in the school's annual play. Children darted back and forth behind the curtain, adjusting costumes, rehearsing lines, and giggling in barely contained enthusiasm. Sophia sat in the second row, her hands tightly in her lap, eyes glued to the entrance. Beside her sat her parents, Margaret and Henry, who had been just as eager for the day as the children. Thomas, Sophie, and Charlotte had been practicing their roles for weeks, each carrying a different blend of nerves and excitement. Thomas, the wise owl, had committed his lines to memory with a scholar's intensity. Charlotte, playing the moon, had practiced her dance until her toes were sore. Sophie, the star, had rehearsed her soft, melodic twinkle with a quiet but fierce determination. "Will he come?" Margaret whispered gently, sensing her daughter's tension. Sophia glanced at the clock on the wall. It was already 10 minutes to curtain, and the familiar knot of doubt began to twist in her stomach. She hadn't told the children that Nathaniel had promised to be there. They had asked, of course, Sophie, in particular, with hopeful eyes that reminded Sophia too much of herself at that age. "I don't know," Sophia admitted softly, though deep down, she wished she could say yes. The doors swung open then, and Nathaniel strode in, slightly breathless but unmistakably there. He was dressed simply, wearing dark jeans and a sweater, as if trying to blend in with the other parents. Sophia's eyes met his, and she let out a quiet breath of relief for the first time. He walked over to her, careful not to disturb the other families. "Sorry I'm late," he murmured, taking the empty seat beside her. "Traffic was dreadful." Sophia nodded, keeping her voice steady. "You made it. That's what matters." Before Nathaniel could respond, the lights dimmed, and the chatter in the hall died down. Sophia could feel Nathaniel shifting slightly in his seat, his nervous energy palpable. As the curtains rose, the children stepped onto the makeshift stage, their faces lit by the spotlight. It was endearingly chaotic. Lines were whispered too quietly or shouted too loudly. One child tripped over a paper tree, and another forgot their cue entirely. But none of that mattered, not to Sophia, not to Nathaniel. When Sophie appeared as the star, she caught sight of Nathaniel in the audience and smiled, bright and genuine. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat, his eyes misting as he watched his daughter twinkle across the stage, waving her hands in deliberate, graceful movements. "She's wonderful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Sophia didn't look at him. "She's always been wonderful." When Thomas, in his meticulously crafted owl costume, delivered his lines with scholarly seriousness, Nathaniel chuckled softly. "He's got my father's focus. It's like watching a tiny professor." And when Charlotte danced onto the stage as the moon, her copper curls bouncing wildly as she improvised a few twirls, Nathaniel laughed aloud, earning a few curious glances from nearby parents. "She's fearless," he said proudly. Sophia didn't respond, but her heart felt lighter than it had in years. For the first time, it felt like she wasn't carrying the weight of it all alone. After the performance, the children burst into the hall, their costumes slightly crooked but their smiles radiant. Sophie spotted Nathaniel first, her eyes widening. "You came!" she squealed, throwing herself into his arms. Nathaniel caught her quickly, holding her close. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Thomas and Charlotte quickly joined in, talking over one another as they recounted their favorite party. Nathaniel knelt, giving each of them his full attention, his expression so genuine that Sophia felt an unexpected pang of gratitude. "I think your owl wisdom saved the forest, Thomas," Nathaniel said with mock seriousness, earning a proud grin from the boy. And Charlotte, your moon dance was so impressive. I think you might have confused the stars. It's because I'm the best dancer, Charlotte replied confidently. And me? Sophie asked softly, tugging on his sleeve. Nathaniel looked at her with a gentle smile. You were the brightest star in the whole sky, sweetheart. Sophia watched from a distance, her chest tightening. She had spent so long fearing Nathaniel would let them down, that he would disappear again, leaving the children hurt and disappointed. But here he was, proving her wrong with every word and action. That evening, as they returned home, the children buzzed with excitement. Can Nathaniel come for dinner? Charlotte asked as they piled into the flat. Sophia hesitated, glancing at Nathaniel, who stood quietly behind them. The older would have said no, shut the door on him before he could get closer. But something had shifted. The walls she had built were beginning to crack. Sure, she said finally. We're just having spaghetti. Nothing fancy. I love spaghetti, Nathaniel said softly, his eyes warm. The dinner was noisy and imperfect, but it was also joyful. The children shared stories from school, interrupting each other with playful arguments and laughter. Nathaniel joined in quickly as though he had always been there. After dinner, as the children climbed into bed, Charlotte turned to her mother. Mommy? Yes, love? Is Nathaniel going to keep coming back? Sophia paused, brushing a strand of hair from Charlotte's face. I think so, she said quietly. I think he's trying very hard to. Charlotte smiled, her eyelids already drooping. Good. I like him. In the following weeks, Nathaniel's presence became a steady rhythm in their lives. Saturday mornings at the park turned into museum visits, art workshops, and cozy afternoons baking in Sophia's tiny kitchen. He showed up consistently, never late, never making excuses. One Sunday afternoon, Nathaniel arrived with paint cans and brushes, fulfilling his promise to help the children paint their bedrooms. Charlotte chose a vibrant blue, declaring it her Sky Kingdom. Thomas picked a deep green for his Space Command Center, and Sophie settled on a soft lavender, claiming it was the perfect color for a dragon's cave. Are you sure I won't mess it up? Nathaniel asked as he rolled paint onto Charlotte's wall, earning an exasperated sigh from her. You're supposed to mess it up, Nathaniel, she said, hands on her hips. That's what drop cloths are for. Sophia couldn't stop the quiet laughter that bubbled up as she watched him take instructions from a 7-year-old with all the humility of a man learning something new. Later that evening, with paint-smudged clothes and streaks on their faces, the children sat around Nathaniel, who was reading them a bedtime story. Sophia lingered in the doorway, listening as he brought the characters to life. Why dragons? He asked Sophie quietly after the story ended. She hugged her stuffed dragon close. Because dragons are strong, even when people are scared of them. They're brave. Nathaniel's voice softened. They sound like you. Sophie smiled sleepily, her trust growing with each passing week. As Sophia tidied the kitchen that night, Nathaniel approached her, his expression serious. I want you to know something, he said softly. This isn't temporary. I'm not leaving again. Sophia turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. She found none. Good, she said finally, because they're starting to believe in you. And you? He asked gently. She hesitated, but then answered honestly. I'm starting to believe in you, too. Winter arrived in London with a quiet elegance. Snow dusted the streets like powdered sugar, softening the city's sharp edges. The flat in Notting Hill smelled of pine needles and cinnamon. A fresh Christmas tree standing proudly in the corner, adorned with mismatched ornaments, paper stars from Thomas, clay dragons from Sophie, and silver moons carefully painted by Charlotte. Sophia stood in the kitchen, rolling dough for cookies while the triplets chattered excitedly in the living room. Their laughter warmed the tiny home in ways that made her heart swell. Today was Christmas Eve, and there was an air of hope and something dangerously close to happiness. For the first time in years, the children had insisted on inviting Nathaniel to spend the day with them. It had been their idea, a request made during Sunday lunch a week earlier. Can Nathaniel come for Christmas? Sophie had asked, her voice soft but determined. He doesn't have a family to be with. Sophia had hesitated. The decision wasn't hers alone anymore, and she had promised herself that she would put the children first. Do you all want him to come? Yes. Charlotte had replied without hesitation. Thomas, thoughtful as ever, had nodded with quiet conviction. That was how Nathaniel Blackwell came to find himself carrying a box of gifts up 3 flights of stairs on a snowy Christmas Eve. He knocked, shuffling his feet nervously until the door opened to reveal a smiling Charlotte. "You're late," she declared, dragging him inside. "I'm 3 minutes late," Nathaniel replied, grinning. "I blame the snow." Sophia appeared from the kitchen, wiping flour from her hands. "Merry Christmas," she said simply, her tone softer than before. "Merry Christmas," Nathaniel replied, his voice sincere. He looked around the room, taking in the tree, the lights, and the triplets, already showing him their decorations. The scene was warm, imperfect, and perfect all at once. "Did you bring the milk?" Thomas teased, earning a burst of laughter from Charlotte and Sophie. Nathaniel groaned in mock exasperation, ruffling Thomas's hair. "I'm never going to live that down, am I?" The afternoon was spent baking cookies, decorating gingerbread houses, and sipping hot chocolate by the fire. Nathaniel had brought thoughtful gifts for the children, carefully wrapped and chosen to reflect their personalities. For Charlotte, a journal with a silver moon on the cover. "For your adventures," he explained as she hugged it tightly. For Thomas, a model rocket kit. "We'll build it together, one piece at a time," Nathaniel promised. For Sophie, a hand-bound book of dragon stories. Inside the cover, he'd written, "To Sophie, the bravest little dreamer I know. Never stop believing." Sophie's eyes widened as she clutched the book to her chest. "You made this?" Nathaniel nodded, his voice quiet. "I wanted it to be special, like you." Sophia watched it all unfold from the corner of the room. Nathaniel wasn't trying to buy their affection. He wasn't forcing himself into their lives. He was just there, steady and present in a way that made her realize how far they had come. As evening fell, the children curled up on the rug, their new gifts spread out around them. The fire crackled softly, and the only light came from the twinkling Christmas tree. Nathaniel sat on the couch beside Sophia, his hands clasped together as he watched the triplets drift toward sleep. "They're incredible," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "They are," Sophia agreed, her eyes resting on her children. Nathaniel turned to her, his expression serious. "Thank you for letting me be part of this." Sophia met his gaze, and her heart conflicted. "They're starting to trust you, Nathaniel. Don't let them down." "I won't," he promised. "I can't compensate for the missed years, but can be here now. And I'll never run again." Sophia nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Good. Because they deserve that." Later that night, after Nathaniel had left, Sophia tucked the children into bed individually. Thomas mumbled something about his rocket. Charlotte hugged her journal like a treasure, and Sophie fell asleep with the dragon book held tightly to her chest. When Sophia finally settled into her armchair, she reached for a small wooden box under the tree. It was from Nathaniel, an unassuming gift she hadn't opened earlier. Inside was a single piece of paper, carefully folded. It was a letter. "Sophia, 5 years ago, I left because I was afraid. I convinced myself I was protecting you, but the truth is, I was protecting myself. It was the biggest mistake of my life. Thank you for raising them to be brave, curious, and full of life. I see so much of you in them, which makes me believe I can be better, too. Trust takes time, but I hope you'll someday believe in me again, not for what I say, but for what I do. Until then, I'll keep showing up. Merry Christmas, Nathaniel." Sophia held the letter for a long time, her heart both heavy and light. She didn't know the future but allowed herself to hope for the first time in years. Spring arrived with the smell of blooming roses and laughter echoing through the Blackwell family estate's garden. It had been Victoria Blackwell's final wish to see her great-grandchildren grow up surrounded by love, and though she was no longer there to witness it, her legacy lived on in the family she had quietly stitched together. The triplets raced through the garden, their giggles mingling with the hum of bees. Charlotte led the charge, her copper curls flying behind her as she instructed Thomas and Sophie in a new dragon adventure. Nathaniel knelt beside a fountain, adjusting a small wooden sailboat that Thomas had built, his face lit with joy. Nearby, Sophia sat on a blanket with a stack of papers from her publishing house, but she barely glanced at them. Instead, her eyes stayed on her children, on the life she had built and the man who had, against all odds, become a part of it. Nathaniel looked up, catching her gaze. "What?" he asked with a small smile. "Nothing," Sophia replied, shaking her head as a smile tugged at her lips. "Just nothing." He walked over, lowering himself onto the blanket beside her. "You can say it, you know. I told you I wouldn't run." Sophia laughed softly, brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "You've proven that." "I meant what I said," Nathaniel continued, his voice serious now. "Trust isn't something I expect. It's something I'll keep earning. For you and them." Sophia nodded, her gaze softening. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Nathaniel looked back at the children, who gathered around a tree, collecting dragon treasure. "We have, and I wouldn't change any of it." The afternoon stretched on, filled with the sounds of children playing and the soft murmurs of conversation. As the sun set, Thomas, ever the inquisitive, tugged on Nathaniel's sleeve. "Can we come back here next weekend?" "Of course," Nathaniel replied, ruffling his son's hair. "And the weekend after that?" Sophie added, hugging her dragon toy tightly. Nathaniel met Sophia's eyes across the garden. "As many weekends as you want." Sophia smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. Life was far from perfect, but it didn't have to be. Perfection had given way to something better, something real. As the triplets climbed into the car, chattering about their adventure, Nathaniel lingered by the garden gate, looking back at the house. Sophia joined him, her voice quiet. "You're thinking about her, aren't you?" Nathaniel nodded. "She would have loved this. Seeing them here. Seeing us here. She would have been proud of you," Sophia said softly. He turned to her, his voice steady. "I'm proud of us." Together, they walked toward the car, where 3 children waited for them. Children who had brought light into the darkest parts of their lives. For Nathaniel, it wasn't about fixing the past anymore. It was about building the future, one step at a time. For Sophia, it was about letting go of bitterness, fear, and the walls that had kept her from believing in second chances. Because sometimes, the best families aren't the ones that follow a perfect path. They're the ones who find their way back to each other, piece by piece, moment by moment. As the car disappeared down the drive, the last sun dipped below the horizon, casting the estate in golden light. And at that moment, it was clear. This wasn't the end of their story. It was a new beginning.